And it's Monday, 1 o'clock, and welcome to Deal Doctor Livestream. We got number of topics we're going to talk about today. But let me first of all start out with a little bit of housekeeping stuff. If you missed the deadline for renewing your license, which was last week, October 31st, don't stress out about it too much. You can still renew your license. It's going to cost you a $20 essentially penalty fee, plus your dues, and then you have to make sure all of your Con Ed credits for 3 years, 18 hours, are completed before December 31st, and you're good to go. So if you missed the deadline, it's going to cost you a couple of bucks, $20. Make sure you have all your Con Ed credits that you're supposed to for. And you can check the CE marketplace and make sure that you have those Con Ed credits. Once you've done that, good to go. Broker Sumo, you've been getting a bunch of emails from Mary regarding filling out your information for Broker Sumo. Please make sure you make some time to do that. It's really important that this new system, it's a great new system, excellent improvement over what we've had before, but we need your cooperation to make sure it is going to work for all agents and that all agents have their information in there. Same thing with Sidekick. Get your face photo up there on your Sidekick page. Along with whatever contact information and any other information that you can put there. Right now, I believe you can Google your name and that page will come up. So if there's nothing there, it looks like you're not in the business. So please do your best to make some time to get that done. Okay. Deal Doctor, October quiz. Since it's November, we can talk about that. The first question in the October quiz was, what are the essential elements in writing an offer, counter offer, or an addendum for your clients when you're negotiating a transaction? A clear description of what your client is asking for, including who will be responsible for the cost and or completion of the request, as well as a deadline for completion. B, a specific time and date the proposal will expire if not accepted by the other party. C, the consequences regarding the transaction as a whole if the proposal is not accepted within a specified date and time. And D, the requirement for a non-refundable earnest deposit. And the only thing that wasn't applicable there is the non-refundable earnest deposit. You don't have to make a non-refundable earnest deposit in your transaction, but all of the other things you do have to have, which is a clear description of what your client is asking for, who's going to be responsible for the cost and completion of the request, and a deadline for its completion. Specify what the consequences are for the transaction as a whole if you can't come to an agreement, and a specific period of time that you are allowing for an agreement to take place. In other words, if a seller or buyer doesn't agree to these terms by 5 p.m. on November 10th, this contract shall be deemed null and void. Those are the kinds of consequences that you need to have in offers in order to make them time is of the essence contract, and to make it very clear that when we pass those deadlines, we are putting the transaction in jeopardy. It's avoiding the kick the can dynamic, which is that nobody's really making a decision. They're just sort of going along, kicking the transaction down the road in hopes that at some point, someday, maybe sometime, if we're lucky, it'll close. And those are the transactions that we wind up having big problems with. So That's my thought for that. Second question of the October quiz was, 2 days prior to a scheduled closing, the sellers decide they do not want to sell and inform the buyer's agent they will not be showing up to the closing. What is the seller's potential exposure to damages? First answer is A, none. The buyer will receive their earnest deposit back, so there are no damages. Second answer, B, the seller could be sued by the listing agent for a commission. C, the seller could be sued by the buyer for any and all damages, including but not limited to the cost of meals in a very nice hotel for the entire period of time that they shop for a new home and wait for it to close. E, the seller could be liable for any and all moving and storage costs while the buyer shops for a new home, and the seller could be liable for the difference in price between the one that they paid for the seller's home and the price they pay on a new home, a different home, which maybe they had to buy it in a rush or they found themselves in a competitive situation. And the answer is all of them. The seller can be responsible for any, none. None is not an answer. The rest of them are. They can be sued by the listing agent for a commission. The seller can be sued by the buyer's agent for a commission as a third-party beneficiary. The seller can be sued by the buyer for any and all damages, which include moving costs, storage costs, putting them up in a nice hotel, and feeding them for a month or 2 or 3 while they go out and buy a new home to replace that one. So I want to make it very clear that when you find yourself in a situation where a seller decides at the last minute that they're going to bail out of the transaction, they are putting themselves at great risk, well beyond this earnest deposit, in terms of damages to the buyer. The same holds true of a buyer who chooses to not come to closing, by the way. If the buyer says, hey, I've decided that I don't want to close, so I'm willing to give up my earnest deposit and walk away. It's okay, you can have the $1,000 or $1,500 or $2,000. Which is another thing we need to talk about at some point, the amount of earnest deposits. But it's okay, you can have the $1,000 and we're going to walk away. Guess what? The damages don't stop there. The damages may, in fact, include months of a seller maintaining the property over the winter, heating, removing snow, all of those things. If they've moved out, all of those things accumulate as damages because the buyer didn't live up to the terms of the contract. So when you have somebody walking away at the last minute and all the contingencies of the contract have been met, you have to be very, very careful to make sure that that party who's walking away understands the level of risk that they are putting themselves in, that it's not simply an EMD issue, and advise them that they need to find an attorney and get the advice and counsel of an attorney. When we get to that point, we cannot give them legal advice, but their attorney can and should be giving them legal advice about the level of exposure that they are putting themselves in when they decide to bail out of a contract at the last moment, again, after all contingencies have been met. So the answer was H. All of the above except A, which is there's no damages, and that's not true. Okay. Question number 3 on October's quiz is buyer's agent calls a listing agent within the inspection period to inform the listing agent that the buyer is terminating the offer based on inspections which were performed 2 days ago. Which of the following is true? A, the buyer has successfully terminated the contract and is free to shop for another home. B, the seller is free to return the home to the market and may unconditionally accept any other offer immediately. The seller may sue buyer for terminating if the buyer does not provide proof of material defect in the property as a cause for the buyer to terminate on inspections. And C, the buyer's EMD may immediately be returned to the buyer. Let me repeat those. The buyer has successfully terminated the contract because the buyer's agent called the listing agent. That doesn't sound right. The seller is free to return the home to the market and may unconditionally accept any other offer immediately. Ooh, that's a little dangerous because potentially the buyer may come back and say, well, wait a minute, I never actually, in writing, terminated the contract. The seller may sue the buyer for terminating if the buyer does not provide proof of material defect. Here's where you're going to have to read your contracts because they differ. In the Kalamazoo board, their contract says that you have to provide proof. If you, for example, if you have an inspection, that you have to provide information which supports if you're asking for a repair or if you're terminating a contract. Again, my Kalamazoo agents, if I'm wrong on that, please weigh in. I don't know the Kim is the expert on the Kalamazoo market, and I know she's on vacation this week, but I'm pretty sure that that's where it is. On the Grand Rapids Association of Realtors purchase agreement, I'm certain that you do not have to provide any information if you terminate within the 10-day inspection period. Again, with TAR and the Mom Board forms, if you're using any other form but GRAR, then you need to read it very carefully. I have them in the other room, and if you run into a question on this, please give me a call and we will pull the forms up and walk through it together. Okay? So those are the answers for the October quiz. Any questions on that? Dom is shaking his head. Moving on. How many of you have gotten involved in new construction? New construction is a bit different in that obviously you are sometimes starting from literally from the ground up. You may have a buyer who wants to build a new house, and so you get in contact with a builder. You may walk into a builder's open house for a house that the builder has constructed. And your buyer may say, wow, I really like this. And that particular house may be on the MLS. It may be available for sale. But your buyer says, I want to move out. I want a little bit bigger master bedroom, or I want a little bit bigger living room. And so your buyer decides that they want essentially to do a variation of what is listed on the MLS. Be aware that at that time you are not guaranteed a commission. That unless you have come to an agreement with that builder how you are going to be paid, then you're not getting paid unless your buyer is willing to pay you as their buyer's agent. And they may be. It all depends on your buyer and the situation, the value that they're receiving in the build job that they're doing. But let's say that you are comfortable, you've reached an agreement with the builder in writing that you're going to be paid a commission. So now you move forward to the next step, which is writing a purchase agreement. How do you write a purchase agreement when you don't know what's going to be in the house? Well, we have a clause for that. In fact, I just want to show you. For those of you who have never visited the clauses section of dotloop, these are all the clauses. That's really, really small type, by the way. But 2.5 pages of clauses that we've created for you to use in a number of different situations. We're always adding to it so that our agents can go in and find words and not have to create new words. Go to the clauses section, learn the clauses, know they are printed out so that you can carry it with you. Go. Put in a, and it goes like this. Buyer's offer to purchase land and or construction package is subject to buyer's review and approval of all construction specifications on or before some date. Usually a month, 3 weeks anyway. The seller shall provide in said construction specifications on or before some date. If construction specifications are not made available to buyer by said date, the buyer reserves the right to terminate this agreement unilaterally, and earnest deposit shall be refunded to buyer immediately. So that not only covers the issue of terminating the contract, but getting the EMD back. So let's go through that just for a moment. Your buyer says, I know that granite countertops are extra. I know that what they put in there normally is not granite countertops, but I want granite countertops, or I want something else. Usually, builders tend not to allow enough in their allowances for lighting, for example. And so between the buyer and the builder, you have to get to a point where they go, okay, we want a little bit of an upgrade in our lighting. We want to upgrade in our carpeting. We need to see that all spelled out in a construction package of specifications form so that they can go, yeah, that's going to work for us. That is what we're going to build. Without that, you're really left to the builder's choices, and that may or may not satisfy what the buyer thinks they're getting. They may think that they're getting the house that they looked at and walked through that was on the MLS, but that may not be the case. That there may have been upgrades in that construction that are not in the construction of the builder's basic floor plan. So I encourage you to review that, understand it completely. If you have any questions on it, give me a call. But it's really a big help to know what the builder and the buyer, that the builder and the buyer have a clear understanding of what is going to be built. It's not unusual at all for a builder to require a non-refundable earnest deposit, because they are investing in essentially a custom home for the buyer. We had a situation 8 days ago or so where an agent was asking us how to construct a contingency when the builder and the buyer had agreed that they had agreed verbally that the buyer could move in to the home, to the main floor of the home, while the builder was still building the basement out for them, and it was a custom job. Ultimately, the buyer was providing a $30,000 non-refundable earnest deposit so that the builder would build out that basement and finish it off for them. But that's a very tricky situation, because once that buyer moves into that main floor, what happens if they're not satisfied with the job that is done, the finish work that is done on that basement that's being completed by the builder? Wow, what do you do now? Well, the builder has to evict the buyer if they're not going to close, or they have to reach an agreement about how the basement is going to be fixed. But they're in possession of the property, and it's unlikely that the property has closed, because the mortgage company is going to want to have all of the information, and including the value of that finished basement, before they close the deal. So in this particular case, we recommended that they hold off the closing and moving in until all of the construction was completed to the buyer's satisfaction. Ultimately, that's what the mortgage company would require in order to finance the full amount of the purchase, including the finished basement. Any questions? Tom keeps shaking his head no. All righty then. How about them well and septic inspections? I love this one. Got a call about a well and septic inspection, whether or not pumping was required. Wow. If you, and again, this is regarding the GRAR form specifically, and it's because, in my opinion, the GRAR form is unclear. In the Grand Rapids Association of Realtors, or the West Michigan Purchase Agreement, excuse me, let me call it by its correct name. When they revised the form, it was their intent to make it more clear, because previously it was very unclear whether or not a well and septic inspection had to be performed at all. And in their attempt to clarify it, in my view, they made it as unclear or more unclear than it was before. And here's why. This is the paragraph regarding well and septic inspections. Y'all can read it, I'm sure. I can barely read it here. So it explains that if there is government protocol, municipality protocol in place, then you have to follow that protocol as it regards pumping. If there is no government protocol in place, which means that the seller may not be required to pump the tanks. If there's no protocol in place, then the seller is required to do both an inspection and pump the tanks. So my question to you is, how is protocol defined? What is protocol and what isn't? Let me give you a case in point. Ottawa County has protocol in place, and their protocol is that you must have a point of sale inspection performed. At every sale, you have to have a well and septic. If there's a well and septic involved, you have to have a well and septic inspection. And only Ottawa County can do it. You can't hire a privately licensed sanitarian to go out and do the inspections. But Ottawa County does not require that the pumps are that the tanks are pumped if it is not inspections. To in my view, under the tanks if the inspection doesn't call for it. Some agents, some brokers are interpreting that to be specifically protocol regarding the pumping. That if there's no requirement to pump the tanks, then if there's no requirement regarding the pumping of the tanks, then the seller has to pump the tanks. That's not my interpretation of it, but ultimately, let's remember, I'm not a lawyer. And so these situations can wind up in front of a lawyer or a judge because the language is unclear. There are municipalities out there that have absolutely no protocol whatsoever. For example, Kent County's protocol is very, very thin. Kent County doesn't require a well and septic inspection, and therefore they don't, by their language, require the pumping of tanks. However, they do require that if a inspection does occur and that inspection requires that the pumps be that the tanks be pumped, that has to happen in order to get an all clear from the county. Wow. So they don't really have a protocol, but they do. It says that if the pumps are to be the tanks are to be pumped as a result of the inspection, then they basically step in and say, yeah, it's got to be done now. Okay. Then there are other folks, other counties and municipalities that have absolutely no regulations regarding pumping of tanks or inspections at all. Those are the counties or municipalities to which the last paragraph applies. If they have no protocol whatsoever, then the seller is required to not only have the inspections, but have the tanks pumped. I said it right that time. Whew. Okay. Jane McGregor. Within 10 days after the I don't know what your question is, Jane. I see that you've copied what's on here, and I've tried to explain it that where no government or county or government protocol is in place, the seller shall arrange and pay for a well and septic inspection as referenced above by a qualified inspector, and the seller shall have the septic tanks pumped at seller's expense. If any report discloses a condition unsatisfactory to buyer, the buyer has a right to terminate or whatever, or make a request for repair. Again, how do you define protocol? What do you consider protocol? If there is protocol, as there is with Ottawa County, the protocol doesn't necessarily require the pumping of tanks, but there is protocol. So I get your question, I understand, but as I said before, it's vague, it's unclear, because even though there is protocol, it doesn't necessarily require that the seller pump the tanks, as in the case of Ottawa County. What I recommend is to agents, if there is some confusion or uncertainty, spell it out. Make it an exception, make it clear in the purchase agreement who is going to do what as it regards the well and septic inspection. Say the seller is going to pay for an inspection and pump the tanks. Makes it very clear that there's no uncertainty about what's supposed to happen. I hope that helps as it regards that question. We got about 1 more minute here in case anybody else has a question. And we're at 1:30. So thanks for joining. I hope that helped. And I will see you next week.